Hi, welcome back to the Informed Descent channel. It's your boy. This is a video I wanted to make the other day, but I've been unfortunately buried in both research and farming obligations. I've recently acquired some goats, and they've decided they don't like being penned, so I've been chasing them around quite a bit. It's been a rather large distraction, but I think we've got them under lockdown now. And I gotta say, I don't feel good about it. I don't feel good about it at all, but they're goats, not human beings. Today's topic is the problem with democracy. And the problem with democracy is you. That's right. We have for far too long put up with the system as it stands. And despite the best efforts of the few to make the required reforms, they never seem to materialize. But the main problem is the tribal football team mentality that we all seem to have about democracy in this country. It's been a long time now since the Liberal Party moved away from classical liberal values, since the Labor Party moved away from the working class and their needs and their issues and representing them. They still nominally represent unions, of course, but the unions have, anyone who's been following what's happened with the CFMEU knows that story. The Greens have gone from being a grassroots movement to being a centralised organisation run by lawyers out of a central headquarters. It used to be in Eve Street. I'm not sure of their current address, but that signalled the end of the Greens as we knew it. Not to mention the way the climate movement, the environmental movement, I should say, has been hijacked into the carbon tax movement, which again serves the big end of town, because who do you think will be running the carbon tax? And look at what's happened with cigarettes. Do you really think putting a dollar value on carbon will slow its production? I don't think so. Then there's the Nationals, who have acted not only not for the national interest, but clearly against the national interest. If you followed the Murray-Darling scandal, for one example, etc., down the line. There are a couple of the minor parties, but they're going to really struggle to do anything serious, I believe. I've come to realize that democracy is, as Michael Malice puts it, the entertainment division of the military-industrial complex, and the big end of town is happy for you to have your say, because through the lobbying and the fact that they've got 3 to 4 years in every case before you get to exercise any kind of power as a citizen of this country, they're pretty happy with things as they stand, because they're in those politicians' ear every day, and they've got suitcases full of money to get what they want. Our institutions are broken. The ICAC and the IBAC, they're sitting there letting corruption happen with very little ramifications. Slap on the wrist at the most for violators. And don't get me started on the police. The police are the worst of all. Well, next to worst of all. It's pretty clear from those few police who have spoken up, either the brave ones who've quit their jobs so that they could speak up and handed back their guns and their badges, which I don't think was the right move, to be honest. They know, particularly in Victoria, they're being asked to act unlawfully and let the courts figure it out later. That's atrocious. That's real Stasi-land stuff. That is absolutely unforgivable behaviour, and they've brought the service into disrepute that it may never recover from. We're going to see God knows what. But on the other side of this, we'll either be living in a very much top-down controlled society, the likes of Eastern Europe in the 20th century, or this country will break so badly that it gets rebuilt, and who knows what form it will take then. But yeah, the problem is us, guys. Now, I know there are powerful interests who throw a lot of money at making sure that the Overton window is just so. It hit me like a lightning bolt 3 or 4 years ago when I realized, gee, isn't it funny? Every major every major issue in this nation seems to roughly break along the 51 to 49% for and against. Now that can't be right. We can't be that partisan a nation that we would cut off our noses to spite our faces to that level that we couldn't ever agree with the other side to get something that we believed was required done. There's a lot of effort that goes into maintaining that Overton window. And then you start to notice things like every major news service is getting its news no longer from its field reporters, despite the billions of dollars each and every one of our media companies, including the ABC, spend on news gathering. They all tend to repeat stories. It used to quite often be through Al Jazeera, originally the BBC, of course. Then in the years after the later part of the Iraq War, we saw a lot of news coming from Al Jazeera across all networks. And then it was other sources, announced usually Reuters. Reuters in particular is a problem. If you know anything at all about Operation Mockingbird and how linked into the intelligence services these large news organizations are, the fact checkers have recently been exposed by the likes of Glenn Greenwald as being bought and paid for political operatives rather than independent truth checkers. So any of your friends who go, oh, Snopes said this, well, they were paid to say that. They didn't care what the truth was. They work for money. There are very few people who aren't cynical in these industries. And then you look at things like the influence of the large asset management firms. How often I would see over the last few years watching the ABC that the figures for a story came from KPMG or Deloitte or PricewaterhouseCoopers, which are in turn owned by larger asset management firms. And pretty quickly you go up this shady pyramid and the people at the top are hidden behind front companies. But the names BlackRock, Blackstone, HSBC, Citigroup, they keep recurring at the top of this pyramid. So we kind of have a vague idea who these people are. And all across the Western world, they seem to be calling the shots. These large asset management firms own things like CSL, Australia's formerly part of the government, but it's a lab that makes drugs. At the moment, it's making preparations. It was making the AstraZeneca vaccine, and now it's probably making either the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. And if you followed anything going on with Peter Petrovsky and his Australian-made Covax vaccine and why it's not being produced, you'll have a few questions. And I had some questions, so I went and looked at the board of directors of CSL, just as one example of this type of corruption that we're dealing with. Some of them are current board members of the Reserve Bank. Some of them have worked in varied industries for Coca-Cola and Rio Tinto. And some of them are involved in the space sector. And if you've got your real tinfoil hat credentials, you'll know that there's a big question mark over the space industry and the missing money in a lot of nations. So it's this small group of shady operators working for even shadier money men. They control our news. They control our drugs. They lobby our governments. And we know nothing about it. We're all too busy with our own careers and our own families and our own bills to pay. And we just fritter away our power in elections to people who haven't represented us for a very long time. But it's down to each and every one of you out there to say that's not good enough. That's absolutely not good enough. People fought and died for the freedoms we have in this country and in other countries around the world. And we're giving them up willy-nilly at the moment, without even the promise that they'll be given back in due course, when the crisis is over. And if the actions of Dan Andrews and, well, I'd like to say his government, but it seems like Dan Andrews is acting almost singularly down there in Melbourne, are anything to go by, I don't think Dan Andrews gets the credit, to be fair. I don't think he is the dictator Dan that people are trying to paint him as. I think, as usual, you need to look up. You need to look higher. Yeah? When I see Dan Andrews on the TV, I see a scared man, not a powerful man. I see a man who knows he's skating the razor's edge to carry out the wants, the demands of his superiors before he gets drawn and quartered by the people of the city that he has crushed and the state that he has crushed. You know, that there's a deep anxiety on the man's face. Imagine being more afraid of somebody shadowy than you are of the 4 million odd Victorians whose livelihoods and lives you've been destroying for 2 years now. The cover-ups, the corruption. It's time to say enough's enough. I lost faith in democracy the very first time I voted. When I was just of majority age, the first thing we voted for was whether or not this nation should be a republic. And I, of course, voted yes. I don't see what the point of having a foreign head of state is at all. I don't think self-determination is just a concept for our Indigenous people. I think it cuts to the heart of who we are and what adulthood really means. But instead, we opted to stay under Elizabeth's skirts. And I think that's had a flow-on effect, which has paved the way for a nanny state. We don't really become adults in this country anymore. The government takes care of us. The government decides what we should pursue. The government decides how we should spend our money. Their regulations tend to favor the same people who have those briefcases of money I was talking about before. And we're asleep at the wheel. We've handed over our greatest gift, I guess you'd call it, our right to vote. And we've put it in the hands of people who don't treat it with any kind of dignity. They've grown accustomed to the power we've handed over, and so they think themselves powerful. But let me tell you, I don't know for how much longer, but that power does still rest with us, the citizens of this country, if you can call us that. Everything that's gone on, whether or not we have rights protected by law in this nation, enshrined in a constitution in this nation, we keep hearing about implied rights. But the fact is, our country is a signatory to the Human Rights Bill that came out of the Nuremberg trials. And so we do have rights in this country because we are human beings, and human beings have human rights. Now, at last count, everything that's going on under the so-called emergency, I'm not denying there's a SARS outbreak. There's a SARS outbreak. Absolutely. There is a SARS outbreak. But I don't think that the certificate of Vax ID was something that they formulated in the wake of this. I think they were waiting for an opportunity to install this. And it's not crazy to think, because all across, particularly the Five Eyes nations, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, and the United States, we see that it looks exactly like what was proposed under the Great Reset by the World Economic Forum, which they've been pushing for years now. It's out in the open. This isn't tinfoil hat stuff. You can look at their own webpage. You can listen to their World Economic Forum Great Reset podcast that they put out more than once a week. This is by design. Absolutely. They were waiting. They were probably hoping that the last SARS outbreak over a decade ago would be enough for them to get this happening. But it wasn't. If you do remember, that was a huge scandal when that happened. The same nations, coincidentally, were wondering what happened to all the money they put into vaccines back then that never materialized, that we never got back. So there's a history of corruption around this sort of thing as it is. This is not, as I said, tinfoil hat territory. So yeah, if you want your country back, do your own research if you have the time. And I know a lot of you have lost your jobs over this, so you've got the time. You've got the greatest resource ever known to humankind right at your fingertips. You're watching me on it right now. It's not that hard. Do you trust everything you read online? No. Same as you don't trust everything you see in the newspaper. Same as you shouldn't trust everything you see on the television. Same as you absolutely shouldn't trust a damn thing your government tell you without doing a little bit of research. It's never been easier. You can go to the people involved's websites. They'll probably tell you what they're up to. You can check on various news sources. Compare and contrast. Somewhere in the middle is the real answer. It's up to you. That's your tax dollars they're spending on new infrastructure, new surveillance infrastructure, on the wars they conduct. That's your tax money. That's your hands getting bloodied. And you cannot abdicate responsibility for that. Because every day that you work, when you're allowed to work, a good chunk of that money goes to feeding that monster. The completely unproductive monster. The parasite. Okay? But the karma comes back to you, whether spiritually or mechanically, however you want to look at it. The work you do feeds the monster that puts more evil into the world. And there's always blowback. There's always blowback. Okay? Our involvement in the Middle East is why we've had the odd Middle Eastern terrorist incident right here in a very sunny southern nation that we have down here, Australia. So very far from the conflict zone. Because our boots are on the ground. And our allegiance is with those who carry out these acts. And it's our tax dollars. Right? So don't be in the passenger seat. Get involved. Personally, I have no faith in democracy. I've become a complete anarchist. I believe, left to their own devices, people with the right education can make better decisions. Be the local expert. You're in charge of you. You should be in charge of your money. You should be in charge of how it's spent. Now, I'm not saying completely dismantle the national defense, but certainly I'm saying I don't want to contribute to adventurism for oil, for lithium, for opium. I don't want to build a surveillance state. Hell, I walked away from Apple because the iPod didn't have changeable batteries, and I was an environmentalist. But now my government's in bed with Apple, with the App Store. So they're getting millions of tax dollars, some of them mine. That's not very democratic, is it? When you think about it. That's something I find completely objectionable, and that's just one example. It's a result of us all being asleep at the wheel, and I myself have been guilty of it. And I've worked for these political parties. I've done work for the Greens over the years, volunteering, helping with smaller candidates in council elections, writing speeches, doing advertising in the paper. And before that, I worked for a federal senator for the Labor Party and a state minister for a short stint. I've seen some of this corruption up close, but I was still asleep to it. I'm not asleep anymore, and neither are millions of Australians, but millions more are asleep, and they're happily feeding this beast. So, if you're watching this, at least try and wash some of the blood off your own hands. And make sure that when you do act politically, it's actually in our nation's interest and the interest of future generations. But my advice is probably to try and walk away from it altogether and take your money out of the system and take control of your life as best you can. And there are ways. There are ways. So that's all I've got to say on that topic. But I'll be back with another one very soon. Peace, love, and Kung Fu. This is Informed Dissent signing off.